You're listening to the People Agenda podcast, brought to you by leading HR, workforce and payroll transformation specialist, Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to the latest People Agenda podcast. It's me, Chris Howard. Thank you very much, as always, for listening. A little bit of a different one for us today because we're actually in a podcast recording studio and we are talking about agentic AI and who owns agentic AI in the current world of work that we're living in. And to do today's podcast in the studio, I have a partner in crime from Lace. It's Martin Colyer, who is our Director of AI, Data and Technology. Did I get that right?
You absolutely did, yeah. Well done.
I was a bit worried about that.
Finally.
Yeah. You call it ADT, and I think I've got an alarm system called ADT. So.
Yeah, it's not that.
Yeah, definitely not that. And we've got the fabulous Chris Cherry from Eightfold. Chris, how you doing? You all right?
Very well. Thank you for having me.
Gents, we are going to talk a little bit about we did a webinar with the fabulous people at Eightfold talking about this particular subject. What we'll do is we'll put it in the actual show notes as well. But I wanted to just pick at some of the questions that we've got because, of course, we have people that may not have listened into the whole webinar. Maybe they just want a little bit of a snippet of some of the conversation piece that are subscribers to the podcast. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start with Chris and asking the sort of the meta question, which is we talked about, does HR own AI or agentic AI, or IT does? But before we do that, it's probably worth, if people don't, they probably have heard of Eightfold, Chris, but maybe if you can tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and then Eightfold.
Yeah, absolutely. Eightfold, we are an AI native HR technology platform. And essentially, we help our customers to adopt a skills first approach to talent acquisition, talent management initiatives. More recently, we've moved into the agentic AI space and thought about how we can include agentic AI as part of our core proposition, but also what tools can we make available, AI agentic solutions can we make available as standalone solutions for our customers as well. I've been with the company for about 4 years. I've never worked anywhere or within a market period that has evolved and innovated as rapidly as we are as a business and as the market is generally. And I think that throws up challenges and questions like some of those you're asking today.
Let's kick it off then. Let's ask one of those questions because I didn't think this is an interesting one that, again, Martin, you did the webinar with the guys from Eightfold, but we'll start with Chris. Like, where does this sit? HR, IT? What's your kind of view on it?
Yeah, I think it's the question that's been asked for years around HR technology, right? Is who owns that decision and who should own that decision? And I think that the new technologies that are being introduced makes it a far more pertinent question. And I think there are things that you'll hear like AI is going to be the most disruptive thing to the workforce since the Industrial Revolution. Comments like that, which are true, but are probably a little bit hyperbolic. So I try and think of it in simpler terms. And the way I look at it is traditionally the workforce has been a user of technology. With agentic AI, the technology becomes a worker in the workforce. And I think because of that, HR has to take center stage in terms of making those decisions and owning that strategy. And that's because of the impact it's going to have. It's going to have a much greater impact on the operating model design, the decisions around what tasks are performed by AI agents, where do they fall within a workflow, what's the handoff process from people to agents and agents back to people. It becomes a lot more HR's domain from an operating model principle rather than that of IT.
Yeah. Martin, from your perspective, I think obviously Lace Partners, we're a HR transformation consultancy, so we're not going to be saying it all sits with IT. It's, even though, as Chris has just pointed out, it's a fundamental processing way in which work is changing. Can you give us a Lace perspective and articulate it a lot better than surely I could?
So I agree with everything Chris has just said. I guess they'll probably add to it, and where I think we will increasingly see the trend moving is that this is going to be a much more critical team sport working between HR and IT, because if we think about the fact that if we cast our mind back 20, 30 years when we were first beginning to implement ERP solutions, it was all about the plumbing. It was all about getting the base of the infrastructure right, the skills that were needed in order to deploy it. And then it was seen as this preserve that kind of HR occasionally touched to complete some transactions, and that would be it. We've now moved so far through that spectrum whereby, to Chris's Chris's point, where the technology is forming part of that workforce, and therefore what the understanding of what agents are doing means that the definition of those things, the ownership of them from an agentic perspective, becomes far more the direction of where HR are going. But there's always going to be, actually, what's that infrastructure that sits underneath it from an IT perspective? What's some of the risk profile, the cybersecurity parts, as we're seeing in the world at the moment, are just so important. We think about some of those big risks. Cyber is one of the big ones. So it's the equivalent of if you're not training, you're not teaching your people in some of the basics of those data, and people leaving erroneous documents on trains, for instance, that's the equivalent of one of your agents going off and having to connect to another one and sharing or leaking pieces of data. So it's, as I say, team sport is the way I would describe it at the moment.
I really like that description, the team sport bit. And actually, it brings me on to the next one. I'm going to stick with you, Martin, and then go back to Chris, if that's all right. Because one of the questions that I have, therefore, is from a leadership perspective, the chief people officer and the chief information officer. Can you, what is that connection between this need for this team sport and how closely they have to work together to define, this is the infrastructure bit, I'll take this, and this bit relates to the people function, and then meshing that together rather than just somebody almost, I'll take ownership of this as a whole entity, a whole thing.
Yeah, and I almost come at it from, again, if I cut similar example, we go back X number of decades, and it would often be that you'd have your HR function and your IT function speaking different languages, and they wouldn't necessarily understand one another. So I guess what we're beginning to see, this is about language and communication, and then understanding what the sort of boundaries and roles are between, and the definition of those two things together. So we will see HR leaders having to become, there's no way that it can't happen, to become far more tech savvy, far more digitally enabled, and get the perspective from an IT leader's point of view. And the same thing is true from an IT leader. You can't just go, I just look after the tech and that's it. Yeah. No, I'm in the service of the people and the business. Therefore, I need to start moving towards that. So you're going to have this great blurring between the two. And in some instances, that will be that you might have HR leaders that are a little more digitally savvy and therefore take some more of the responsibility, particularly if I think about data and some of the areas of that ownership. And in other instances, it may well be slightly further back the other way. But I think we're really at an inflection point, and like the next 10 years, you can start to see some of those roles beginning to either blur or actually dissipate into different types of roles. And I know we talked about the chief AI officer, for instance, and it was like, is that just a now kind of thing, or is that going to be something that's persistent over whatever time period we're talking about? Yeah,
Chris, I want to bring you in on this about that role of how the CPO and the CIO need to be closer aligned. But I really like what Martin said, so maybe just some thoughts on the language and the communication part as well. Because at Lace, we've written papers about, and I've done podcasts with CPOs talking to them about how do you speak the language of the C-suite or the CEO or the CFO. But what we're talking about here is how you speak in the language of the CIO and vice versa. So can I get some reflections on that? Because I think that's quite an interesting point.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that point around operating as a team and understanding accountability, but understanding what the right area of accountability for each of those people within a team is. So something like governance and AI compliance, often seen by HR as a blocker to what they want to do, actually viewing it more as an enabler for what they want to do, and ultimately air cover, security for what they're trying to achieve. But while it's separate teams doing those two things, it's seen as somebody stopping us from what we're trying to achieve. So how do you bring them both together? I think there's an interesting argument for, do you combine the two functions? If we're talking about a blended workforce of AI agents and humans, perhaps the response to that is to blend the team between HR and IT. And there's a number of companies out there that have done that. I was reading an article on the BBC yesterday, actually, doing a bit of research.
Nice. Always nice.
Some homework.
Company I'd never heard of, called Covision, who have 27,000 employees. And they were talking about doing just that. And the fact that under a single team with a single leader and a goal that they're all trying to work towards, they were able to achieve things more quickly. They did point out, to your point, that culturally, they're very different teams, speak different languages, operate in different ways. And that's one of the things that you really have to address in order to get that working well.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And actually, it leads me on to my next question, which was around how do you get HR and IT teams to work more harmoniously when scaling agentic AI? So I'd love to get some initial thoughts on that. You can also build on what Chris was talking about.
So I think firstly, we talk about, if I come in from a slightly different angle, we talk about how and where you deploy agents by understanding the work you need to do and the tasks people complete. But the same thing is true if you're understanding what your colleagues are doing from an IT or an HR perspective. You've got to understand their perspective as to what are the things that matter to them, what's within their remit and kind of span of control that they have to support as part of the role. And once you do that, you start to see where the opportunities are. And the cultural piece, I think, is massive, because you've not only got culturally what happens between an IT function and an HR function, you've then got industry-wise, what's the things that I have to consider. If it's financial services, there's clearly massive regulatory elements that would now need to be considered. And then it's as an IT leader, what do I need to be considering that I wouldn't as an HR function? So that's almost the start point. Start with the human to human. Let's just understand what we all do and try and figure out that sort of contract between one another as to what good looks like and where we want to go. Then it's beginning to say, actually, let's break that down further and see where within those two things are the things that we've got outcomes we're driving towards or different ambition that we need to try and support, and where do we go? So it's starting with a lot of the basics of, we talk a lot about AI, but actually us as humans just need to try and understand one another first and then start to figure out where we go with it.
Yeah. Chris, any kind of thoughts, any build on that?
Yeah, I think it's around defining those roles and understanding where there is, or first of all, implementing a common outcome, a common objective. And you either do that, the business sets that for the two functions operating as independent functions, or if you combine it as an individual function, it's a common goal for everybody within that function. But then I think it's looking at the skill sets and understanding those roles, looking at common enablement where you can do so something like AI fluency. Like, we've all got a responsibility to become more fluent in terms of AI. And then what are the individual skills that those people are bringing to the table as well? Whether it's the kind of ethical governance that might be covered by HR versus the technical governance and compliance that might be covered by IT. But it's understanding those roles and finding commonality there as well between those roles.
Yeah, sure. I want to talk about ROI, and let's talk a little bit around that. How do businesses move into being a little bit more practical when it comes to ROI? Because I think there's a lot of conversation about we can do things faster, quicker, AI agent creation. I've been creating agents myself for marketing tasks that are then supporting me with social media and bits like that. And it's all very well doing this, but at some stage you need a more holistic perspective onto, okay, how do we quantify the success of this? Because if you can quantify the success of something, then you can then build that in on a wider scale, rather than just have little silos like me, Chris Howard, marketing director at Lace Partners, going off and doing it because I find it interesting. Yeah. But pulling that all together. I know there's some work actually you've been doing internally as well, Martin, haven't you? Yeah,
it's really good question, because let's face it, I think we've been pretty patchy from a business perspective on the whole in managing what a good ROI looks like. I think we theoretically know it, but actually what we do in practice really doesn't always come into it. And I think with AI, you've now got, and the role of agents is beginning to think about it in the different context against coming back to what's the outcomes, what's actually understanding what the numbers are that are driving those outcomes, or would be a key input to understanding its value. So firstly, I think it's having that front of mind, because I think we've seen the proliferation of pilots going out there. This is a cool bit of tech. Let's go and play with it and see what we can do with it, which on the one hand is not a bad thing, because there's upskilling that's happening as part of that. But when it's only happening in pockets and there's no control and around it, then it's, well, to what end? Because it's difficult to scale. So I think bringing that back to, okay, let's get some of the at least framework around it so that we are at least measuring what good looks like, what the cost that's gone into it, and then what the impact is. Because to one of the previous points, how do you scale it? Well, you're going to scale it if it gets adopted, and if it's getting adopted, then it's likely that it is going to be a return on investment because it's having an impact. Or you're potentially finding that there's things that unintended consequences of it that can actually have amplifier effects with investment. But the basics will come back to getting some good discipline around measuring and having some kind of values that come off the back of it. Yeah. Chris, I'm going to give you a few options of questions to answer with relation to that ROI piece. You can talk about, because Martin's obviously talked a little bit from at Lace, this is what we're thinking about. But I'm also interested in client perspective as well, like clients that you work with, anyone that's doing this well, if you can think of. I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, so you don't have to obviously name any clients, or even just think about Eightfold as an organization, your perspective, like how do we demonstrate ROI through the agentic AI universe that we're starting to live in? Sure. I can give you a response from an Eightfold perspective as to where we've decided to focus. But then I think there are more broad considerations that I think I can share as well. But from our perspective, we looked at where is there the greatest opportunity to have the biggest impact in the shortest amount
of time. So we look specifically at the TA process and initially at screening, moving into deeper assessments, but essentially that AI interviewing space. And ultimately that's because there's a lot of work and cost that is sunk into that. A lot of people that are missed. So the experience is also bad. So there's a real opportunity to use agents to scale that work and also improve the experience of people who are applying for those jobs. Some would argue, I don't want an interview with an agent, but on the flip side, what about the hundreds of candidates that never hear anything when they apply for a role? And I think that's where we've decided to focus. So it's all about where is there a problem that you can fix at scale that you can apply some very tangible, demonstrable ROI to. I think from a customer perspective, what we have to focus on is safe use cases. So still those principles, but where can they apply those within a safe context so that they can start to get those learnings, but without too much risk. I think it still comes down to those elements, still comes down to how can you improve efficiency, effectiveness, and not deliver a substandard experience. But that might not be interviewing. It might be internal HR queries and turning around those much more quickly. So I think there are other use cases, but I think the safety piece is really important.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting. We've got a couple of minutes left and I wanted to do a little bit big picture, future thinking. So I'm going to start with you, Chris, this time. How do you think the HR function is going to be impacted moving forward through the rapid rate of change that we're seeing through the use of AI agents? And how does the function future-proof itself?
Good question.
Difficult question.
No, I think future-proofing itself comes down to skills and learning those new skills and going back to understanding the role of the human that technology cannot replace. So applying the humanity to that process. Again, AI fluency, massive skill that we all need to learn, and equally that will help future-proof that function. In terms of what the future looks like, I know that I don't want to steal your thunder. I know that on the podcast you talked about the 10-80-10 piece, and we talk about that a lot as well. We talk about the concept of an infinite workforce where humans are responsible for the strategy and the governance and the orchestration of AI, with AI being responsible for the scale of the work that's being done. And I think that's what we're moving towards. I think the humans kind of future-proof themselves by being human, but by also learning those skills that will earn them that place within that 10-80-10 equation.
Martin, just to wrap us up, thoughts on that?
Yeah, we're crystal ball territory. I think if I could have given you a view of where we were 3 months ago relative to now, I probably put some money on it, would have made a fair bit. But I think it probably comes back to, and it's echoing Chris's point, to where are the sort of more certainties or controllables that we've got. So upskilling 100%, like it's really considering the doubling, echoing Chris's point about doubling down on the things that we as humans do naturally, that we are now increasingly seeing that AI will do far better than us. And we just need to determine those things accordingly. As businesses, I think if we flip it to some practical pieces, as opposed to going, look, in 2 years' time, we're going to be here, I would go, actually, for most businesses, get the data right. Get your data right, because irrespective of where we go, a good data set is going to feed and breed intelligence. Yeah. Bad data is just going to yield artificial stupidity. And that's not what we want. That's not will support adoption. It's not going to help. So working through that, getting the basics right is always going to be the right thing to do.
And that's a really good bookend to the end of the podcast today. Gents, really interesting. This is a subject that I think probably in 6 months' time or 12 months' time is moving so rapidly that even you were saying about the crystal ball, I bet even the conversation probably
we'll have a
changes.
Totally different conversation in 6 months.
Exactly, which is fascinating. And it's really interesting for people who are particularly like we do. We have a passion about it. Hopefully you've enjoyed listening to this podcast as much, certainly as I have enjoyed quizzing the gentlemen. If you would like to find out more, if you want to connect with Chris or Martin, we'll put their LinkedIn details in the show notes as well, or you can reach out to either of us via Lace Partners website or the Eightfold website, which we will put on the show notes as well. But from myself, thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.
And Martin, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We will catch you next time on the People Agenda podcast. Bye-bye.